Welcome into the Autzen Audibles Podcast. Matt Prehm, Erik Skopil, Jared Mack on the show. Welcome to your Friday edition of the Autzen Audibles Podcast. And today, we're not going to talk much NFL draft, even though KT got selected on Thursday. We're going to save that for next week once the full draft is done. But nonetheless, congrats to KT getting his name called. Always a special moment. But we are going to talk about KT on this podcast because in the spring game, guys, I think all of spring, one of the major discussion points was who's going to step into KT's shoes, who's going to be that premier pass rushing player on Oregon's team. Some of it's scheme, some of it's player. It's probably unfair to ask if one guy to simply just replace all the production, but nonetheless, DJ Johnson dominated the spring game, 4 sacks, 5 tackles for loss, and it's generated a discussion point that Erik was like, we need to talk about this, that KT and DJ could be very similar in terms of talent.
Yeah, I think so. The comment was made is that they're pretty close in talent, and I take issue with that. The question of is the production possibly going to be similar, I think is actually up for debate, and I wouldn't be surprised because, I mean, if you look at what – we'll get to the talent part in a moment here and why I was kind of frustrated, but you look at what Thibodeaux did in 2021, 7 sacks, 12 tackles for loss. I could see DJ Johnson having a year similar to that. He could have a year maybe even a little better than that. I'm not totally selling that idea. The issue I have is the talent being comparable because I think that's such a disservice to the athlete and the player Kayvon Thibodeaux is. And by the way, the reason DJ Johnson in part was playing offense and not playing defensive end, which I think everybody understands is his more natural position, was because he couldn't get into the lineup with Thibodeaux here because Thibodeaux was just a better player. Thibodeaux spent 3 years at Oregon and was an early NFL draft pick, as we learned yesterday. While as DJ Johnson, this is his 6th year of college football, and I'm gonna guess the best case for him is probably 3rd or 4th round if he has an awesome season, and that's probably reaching too. So, I saw this kind of narrative around social media, and it comes down again to the recency bias thing of when a player has a big moment, it's the immediate thing is to compare him to somebody similar and try to qualify and equate them as similar. And I just think these two are so far off in terms of the talent that the narrative that these two are close, which is what I was saying, or on this even footing is just ridiculous. I know it was a spring game and the stats were awesome and everyone got excited as we talked about in this podcast. It's not like DJ Johnson was going against Oregon's left tackle Stephen Jones for most of the game or against Luke Sala for the game. Those players were on the either opposite team or other opposite side of the line. Primarily, he was going against Feope Lalu and Bailey Jaramillo, and I don't want to disrespect those two players, but those aren't the players Kayvon Thibodeaux is going against in a college football game where he's racking up 2 sacks or 3 sacks against Utah or UCLA these last couple of years. So I got a little bit perturbed by that narrative. I snapped a little bit at somebody on the message board because of it, and I kind of just wanted to explain my piece on that because it's not necessarily the production part, because I actually think the scheme will probably provide DJ Johnson opportunity to have a really significant year, because I do think the way that the simulated pressures operate, he's going to probably be able to deal with more one-on-ones or at least more confusion up front, whereas I think a lot of the time Kayvon Thibodeaux was not a lot. He was most of the time double teamed, triple teamed. He was taking the entire attention of a defense. And so the stats weren't as staggering as maybe some people expected. So there's my piece. I know I'm a little bit fired up, but I'll just be honest. I literally messaged Matt. I was like, we need to talk about this because I'm just kind of perturbed by the whole narrative that's being created, and I want to shoot it down as quick as possible.
I mean, we're not trying to be negative to DJ Johnson, but
yeah, not at all.
But Kayvon Thibodeaux was a consensus or a unanimous first team All-American. That is pretty substantial, and the talent to be able to do that is pretty ridiculous. And he very, 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 very special player. It's why he went so high in the draft this season. Now, to the question we're going to pose here, buying or selling, can DJ replicate some of or all of the type of impact that Kayvon Thibodeaux produced at Oregon in 2021. Thibodeaux had 7 sacks, 12 tackles for loss, 2 forced fumbles. He had 50 tackles. Can DJ Johnson replicate those types of numbers? Different scheme, different coaching staff, different philosophy. So it's not a straight apples to apples comparison here. But buying or selling this?
I also want to note, I think we kind of have to prorate the stats because Kayvon played 10 games last year, whereas DJ could play as many as 14, or if we're really optimistic, 15 games.
15, yeah.
I mean, that's really optimistic. But I actually am probably pretty close to buying the idea that he can have a season that is similar in the sack total and the tackles for loss total. I don't think he's going to be as impactful in terms of tackles, because I think 50 is actually a pretty decent number for a player who's playing that spot. But I'm not going to be stunned if he has 6 or 7 sacks. I'm really not. And I'm not going to be stunned if he's impactful to 10 or 12 tackles for loss if he's starting and playing as much as we think. I also will say I'm probably now, despite calling out the recency bias and kind of being a creature of the moment, also probably occupying that space, because 2 weeks ago before the spring game, I would have said this is a ridiculous sentiment. And so right now, the fact that I'm kind of not totally blown, I'll sell the stats won't match, but I guess the point I was trying to make was I'm not going to be blown away if it's similar, but then I'm also catching myself being I think that's kind of a stupid take. So,
so pick one or the other, man. Come on.
I'm selling it, but I also just want to acknowledge I'm not going to be stunned at all if DJ gets close, but I also think the stats are we have to prorate them, so it's probably closer to 10 sacks and 15 tackles for loss. And if that's the case, then I'm selling for sure. If we're doing 12 and 7, I'm not stunned if it's in that ballpark.
I'm selling hard. I don't think it comes close, but I think the key word in Matt's question is impact. And while Kayvon Thibodeaux did not necessarily get all the stats everybody would have liked him to get in his final year at Oregon, his impact on the offense, the opposing team's offense, is going to be far more significant and far more important than anything that DJ Johnson will do. And that's no discredit to DJ Johnson. We've said this multiple times now on this podcast. We all believe he's a good player. I think he can post, similar-ish stats. He'll be the same type of stats at least. But the impact that Kayvon Thibodeaux had at a unanimous All-American, as Matt said, a number one player out of high school, a high draft pick in yesterday's draft. I'm selling that idea that he'll be as impactful. I am buying the idea that the defense constructed by Dan Lanning and Tosh Lupoy will give him plenty of opportunities to be disruptive and wreak havoc and do things like that. But, this goes back to Erik's original rant, and we love a good Erik Skopil rant on this podcast. There's no comparison here between the two. I think they just happen to play the same position, and that's about all they have in connection with in terms of on-field production. It's like Matt opened with, it's an apples to oranges thing. This is a first-round draft pick compared to somebody who's going into his 6th year, who's been flip-flopping between defensive end and tight end. So I'm selling the idea that DJ Johnson could make as big of an impact.
I'm selling too. I will buy if it was, can he make an impact where he's a consistent pass rusher and a disruptor, an all-conference caliber guy. I would buy that. But if it's straight up production that KT had, I'm not going to buy that. I'm with Jared. I don't think he comes close. I just think if he was that good, he would have gotten on the field even with KT at Oregon the last 3 seasons. If he had KT level production. And I think DJ Johnson is going to be a good player in 2022. I think he's going to be their number 1 pass rusher, him or Swinson. But and he may even hear his name called this time, next year on the Saturday, day of the NFL draft. He may get drafted. He's got the physical attributes to do it. It's just I don't see the All-American level production to match Kayvon Thibodeaux. All right, next question here. buying or selling. Erik came up with this one. Oregon had 23 turnovers in 2021. 2020 was a year in which they really struggled to create turnovers. 2019, they were absolutely tremendous from a national perspective. So this defense in the last couple of seasons, they certainly have created turnovers. They were 23rd in the country, or not 23rd in the country last year, but they were good at creating turnovers. Will this defense in 2022, again, new defense, new scheme, new philosophies, will they beat that 23 turnover number that Oregon had last season?
And but before I answer, why this interested me was Oregon forced 5 in the spring game, and afterwards Dan Lanning didn't suggest, he said, of the coaches worked with, Tosh Lupoy is the one who's prioritized turnovers the most, and that led to Tosh being asked that question a couple of days later about the value of forcing turnovers and how they wanted to be plus 1, 2, 3, and how that correlates with winning and all that. And so I think it's kind of in the kind of the conversation we've been having this week about forcing turnovers. Let's kind of compare and contrast to last year's defense, which I think was ranked top 20 last year in the country.
Mm-hmm.
23 is a good number, by the way. Like,
yes,
I think I set a good over/under number here, probably better than I do with the arrival of coaches when they arrive at media availability. And now I'm giving an inside joke that nobody listening will understand, but I digress. I think I'm going to I'm buying more because I'm trying to be real optimistic here. What they are missing without question is that Verone McKinley, who led the country in interceptions last year, that kind of ball hawk at the back end, or at least it's not proven who that is. I will also say, as we talked about on our show a couple of days ago when we were talking about those safeties at the back end and the combination of Bridges and Addison, is best case with those two is Bridges was a ball hawk in the state of Alabama. Jared ran through that, I think, of the all-time leader in the state of Alabama, or was tied for it at one point.
He's the all-time leader.
He's still tied? Okay.
All-time leader.
Yeah, he is a very capable in that. We haven't seen it, but he's very capable hypothetically in that area. Ryan Addison coming out of high school, this is what everybody was raving about, was his length and his ability to go make plays on the football. It's why he was a high 4-star recruit. It's why when he got to Oregon, there was conversation between wide receiver, where he ended up starting, and defensive back, and now he's a defensive back. This wasn't a DJ Johnson thing with Brian Addison, by the way, of like, is he defense, is he offense? This was a legitimate, everyone was no one really had a consensus on where Addison fit. I think a lot of people probably thought defense was better, but Oregon was down people at receiver at the time. That was that fall where everybody got hurt, and that's why he started there, I think, or played a role. So I look at Addison as someone totally capable of filling that role. And then the other part for me is how aggressive this defense aims to be. In terms of getting after the quarterback and being, a little bit exotic in its approach of getting after the quarterback, of getting up the field with run blitzes. I think they're going to be here's probably my guess is the interception total isn't eclipsed, but I bet they force more fumbles and recover more fumbles. And I think it's not going to be by a lot because I think 23 is a really strong number, but I'm going to buy that they have 24 or more in 22.
I think this is one that I'll buy. It's a good line, like Erik, like you mentioned, it's a good one. Last year was 23, and that was 19th in the country. That's pretty darn good. They lose Verone McKinley, but I also feel like the return of Bennett Williams, who theoretically should play a full season, barring injury. I think that's going to be an impactful guy. Bridges, he had 36 interceptions in high school. He knows what he's doing back there. He's a ball hawk, to say the least. Addison, you just went through it. I think he's got potential. As far as the quarterbacks go, I think this is going to be a little harder. They're not always getting interceptions, more likely in zone than anything else. But yeah, to me, this all comes down to how aggressive the pass rush is and how aggressive pressure is. Just because quarterbacks are more inclined or more susceptible to make mistakes when there's pressure coming at them. And if there's enough pressure coming at them with 4 or 5 man fronts, where Oregon can drop 7 or 6 guys back into coverage, there's a pretty good chance that there could be an interception thrown. But I'm with you, Erik. I think they force more fumbles than they do interceptions. And I don't think they go over that marker of 23 by much. I think it'll be a 24, maybe 25. But again, that's still I mean, last year, if you had 25, you were tied for 11th in the country in turnovers. Cincinnati was the outlier at 34, which is kind of nuts.
Unbelievable.
But that's a very well coached team. It's a talented team in a conference that isn't necessarily the best in competition with it. But that's exactly what they should be doing, frankly. So I think again, I'll buy that they go over 23, but I don't think it'll be by much, and I think it'll be more forced fumbles than it is interceptions.
So, what if I told you Oregon has gained more turnovers than Georgia has, and what is that? 3 of the last 4 seasons, or 4 of the last 5 seasons.
Yep.
And the only year in which Oregon didn't outgain Georgia in turnovers was 2020 because the Georgia Bulldogs, they played a full season of football. Oregon played 7 because of COVID and the pandemic. So the scheme from just a pure data standpoint that Oregon was running created more turnovers than what Georgia did. Now, it's not 100% apples to apples, different conferences, better talent at the SEC than in the Pac-12. That has to factor into it there. So Oregon is accustomed to creating a bunch of turnovers. And I think the scheme adjustment that Oregon will make will only enhance the turnovers created, especially with the talent drop that Lanning will be facing in the Pac-12, opposed to playing or coaching, I guess, in the SEC. So I'm going to buy this as well. I just think this defense will create, on average, more than 2 turnovers per game, unless they play a little bit, 13 or 14 games, which I would expect them to be right around that number as well. So it's going to be a defense that creates turnovers. And I think they've got the playmakers at all 3 levels to justify that buy. DJ Johnson, Swinson, Funa are terrific pass rushers. You've got some just ferocious linebackers in Sewell, Bossa, Flo, and then in the back end, you've got some ball hawks. Bennett is a guy that's had success in getting interceptions. Christian Gonzalez as well, and then you throw in Bridges and Addison's height, and you've got the recipe there to create some turnovers via interception. So I'm buying this as well. I think the defense could be in a place to be pretty special in 2022. All right, let's take a quick break. When we come back, we'll finish up this podcast. And you've been listening to the Autzen Audibles Podcast. All right, welcome back to the Autzen Audibles Podcast. Buying or selling day. We brought this up off show hand. Will Oregon's offense throw for 3,200 or more yards in 2022? We should note this isn't Oregon's starting quarterback because, hey, while I necessarily don't think it's going to happen, we could see a change at quarterback mid-year, or a guy could get hurt mid-year, and that kind of impact the individual award. So we're going with the team perspective here. And will they throw for 3,200 or more yards in 2022?
This is really a hard one for me. I think my inclination is I'm going to sell. You look at what Bo Nix, and again, now I'm putting the cart before the horse with who the quarterback's going to be, because that's not fully decided, even though I think we all expect that's what will happen. But Bo Nix's best year at Auburn was 2,500 yards his freshman year. That was with Dillingham as the coordinator. I think Oregon's offense will be more explosive than that, but 3,200 is actually a pretty good total. You go back and look at what Oregon has done recently. That's not a number they hit every year. And I know I think people are probably going to expect me to buy here, or people would lean buy just because the offense looks so explosive in the spring game. I'm not saying that's an aberration, but like it's probably not, and maybe it will be. It probably shouldn't be the expectation you'll connect on a pair of 70-yard passes every game or a 40-yard pass every game like they did. And so I think that they'll get close to 3. I think they'll eclipse 3,000. I think this is a good line. I'm going to say I'm going to sell, but I'm going to say it's pretty close. Like they're probably over 3,000, but 3,200 it's a good number. I think I'm also learning from a year ago where we set the line similar for Anthony Brown, and he didn't really come very close.
I'm buying. I think it should probably be surpassed kind of easily. Oregon finished with almost 3,100 yards last year, 3,098 to be specific. And that wasn't an offense where they probably ran 70% of the time and threw 30% of the time, unless they were down in a game, which they would run 60% of the time and throw 40% of the time. So a run-happy offense is no longer the case. Oregon will obviously still run the ball because they have really good talent, the offensive line, the running back, et cetera, et cetera. But I still anticipate if there's going to be 4 plays or 5 plays, like the majority of them are going to be passing attempts. I think Nix is finally going against defenses that aren't Alabama or Georgia or LSU or Texas A&M or just really good defenses in general. So I think that's going to help a lot for him. Not to say the Pac-12 doesn't have good defenses, but it's not SEC level defenses. So, and obviously his relationship with Kenny Dillingham is strong. Erik just mentioned he threw for the most amount of yards in his career under Dillingham as offensive coordinator at Auburn as a freshman. He's back now as a senior. I think there's a lot of potential to throw for more than 3,200 yards. It'll always come down to who the starting quarterback is, injuries, all that stuff. But just a surface level thing right now, I wouldn't be surprised if Oregon got 100 more yards in a season to get to 3,200 yards compared to last year. I know they played 14 games last year, which may or may not happen this next season, but I would anticipate they play 13 games. So another 200 yards. I mean, Anthony Brown was throwing for 221 yards a game. I think whoever is the starting quarterback for Oregon can surpass that, especially with what the offense has shown, at least so far, what the fundamentals are and what they want to do. So I'm buying 100%.
So since 2016, this has happened twice. In 2019, Herbert is his senior year. He did it by himself. He threw for 3,400 yards, and the team went for 3,600. The year before, in 2018, they did it as well, thanks to punter Blake Mamone's 28-yard pass, which put them over the 3,200 threshold. So maybe that's like 1.5, but we'll count it.
It counts.
It counts. 2020, the COVID year, Oregon played 7 games. And so that's one in which maybe you dig a little deeper, you take out the average and you multiply it by 13 because they were a bowl-eligible team. And they are 1 yard short by that metric with 3,199 yards. So this is a team that's done it twice in 6 years. But I'm going to buy. I think this is one I'm not as confident in as the other two, but maybe it's a little recency bias. But looking at what the offense was and did in the spring game, knowing this offense wants to be a bit more aggressive, I think Jared made a great point that I think some of the play calling certainly impacted what happened in 2021 with Anthony Brown and his ability to throw the football deep. I think they could have clearly against Oklahoma, Brown showed he could make the plays. And I don't know why we didn't see any of that stuff until then. So I think with an adjusted, play call distribution, with a little bit more aggressive head coach who's willing to take some shots, combined with, quite frankly, more talented receivers, I think potential talent in the receiving core than the last couple of seasons. I think that will make for a recipe where Oregon gets over the 3,200 threshold. But if it was 3,400 or like we originally set it at 3,500, I would not buy. 32 is, I think, very, very, very difficult to make a pick here.
Jared, what if it was 35? Would you have bought it?
Probably not. There were only like 20 teams last year to get over 3,500 yards, and those were all like, very pass-heavy teams, like an Ole Miss or something like that. And Ole Miss barely snuck in. I think it was mostly because Matt Corral was injured for the last couple of games. But 35, I wouldn't buy unless you're Western Kentucky, because then you're buying all day.
And one stat I wanted to throw out, and I guess I maybe got lost a little bit. I was thinking individual quarterback, and I know Matt specified differently. In the history of Oregon football, 5 quarterbacks have thrown for more than 3,200 yards in a season. So I was, I guess, trying to be a little bit conservative of not building it up as like Bo Nix is going to have a top 5 single season passing season, which it sounds like he might. But I think the other part, in terms of making an assessment of like how many assuming Bo Nix is the quarterback, how many opportunities will the other quarterbacks have to come in and throw the football around? Assuming it's full health, is Oregon going to be in a position this year? And this speaks a little to like our expectations for the team, I guess, to be ahead so much that they are able to throw in the third and fourth quarter with their backups, which we just haven't seen the last 2 or 3 years. I know that was a byproduct, a bit of some kind of offensive, strategy and philosophy, and just in general. But I think that's another component here of like, will Ty Thompson, Jay Butterfield, Tom Snee, hypothetically, I guess Blake Mamone being, the punter, you never know. Maybe Chris Hudson, we just saw him throw a couple or try to throw a couple in the spring game.
Mm-hmm. Will Hutchinson could be the punter over Snee. We don't know what happened there. I'm just saying, like, some of the getting to that as a team as opposed to the individual passer will depend upon kind of how quickly they're able to finish teams off and continue throwing. Because like I look at this list and Marcus Mariota threw for like almost 4,500 yards in his final season. They were so dominant in a lot of those games that if he would have played all 4 quarters, it's probably close to like 5,000.
Yeah.
I'm just curious on what the impacts of that will be. So I think
it's a worthy question. I mean, just looking at the schedule, like I feel like there's really only 4 games that we can sit here at the end of April and say like this is going to be an opportunity for Oregon's backups to potentially get in the game. Who knows if it's even like a full quarter or if it's just like 2 or 3 series. Right. I think those games are Eastern Washington, which is the second week of the season in Eugene, the Stanford game in Eugene, which is October 1. I would also say the Colorado game on the road, and then the Washington game at home. I think the Huskies could be pretty bad. But Utah certainly isn't one. I don't think Oregon State is. I don't think Cal will be. That's a road game. I don't think UCLA will be. Tucson against Arizona will not be one in my eyes. Washington State, BYU, and Georgia. I mean, are there games that you would agree with?
You don't have Georgia on that list?
You think Oregon could get blown out in that one?
No. You don't think Oregon's going to blow out Georgia, Matt? No?
No.
And I guess just I know we've turned this into a non-buy-sell component here on this podcast, but it's kind of interesting to talk about. The other part here is if these are close games that Oregon is trailing in the fourth quarter, that could lead to more passing yards. Yeah. If these are all really competitive games, Bo Nix or whoever the starter is will be potentially throwing for more yards. The old Matt Ryan special in the NFL, if you're like a fantasy football guy of like, the Falcons are down. He has 220 yards going into the fourth, and he throws for like 400.
Down by 18.
Yards. Yeah, exactly. And I'm not putting that on Oregon because I don't think Oregon's going to be in a lot of those situations. But like hypothetically, could we see some of that as well in terms of like I was trying to find an excuse for like backups not throwing a lot, but if these are all really competitive games, maybe it actually helps getting that over because it's been a long time.
That might be Georgia. It might be a game where they're trying to fight off being down 2 scores.
I also think Arizona is a candidate, even though I think Arizona is really going to improve to be. I mean, that team didn't win a lot of games last year, so that would be another game you're running through the schedule. That kind of caught my ears. And Washington as being a blowout is bold. Although I will say, like, I'm not thrilled with everything that's going on up there, or maybe I am, but if I'm a Washington fan, I'm not super enthusiastic based on
that. Was the one I was least confident in, but because it's in Eugene, I slid it in there. I mean,
yeah, it's good. That's going to be those games are always tough. I don't know.
Yeah.
I mean, unless it's the 2016 Huskies, those games are usually pretty close. Especially, I mean, even last year with where Oregon was, everybody expected it to be a blowout, but not so fast.
The last 3 years have been.
I think weather impacted last season.
Yeah, it did.
Yeah,
Definitely did.
for sure.
I was just gonna say that the last 3 years have been close, but if you go look at the 15 or whatever before that, Oregon won a bunch by a lot of points, and Washington had those 2 years in a row where Oregon was really down, or the backup quarterback was in, where they won by a lot.
Yeah, I was there.
No worries.
All right. That's going to do it for us here on the Autzen Audibles podcast. Thank you for listening to the show. We'll be back on Monday with a mailbag and then later on next week as well. So until then, you've been listening to the Autzen Audibles podcast.
Talk to you later, folks.
Peace.